So what we'll do is we'll start off first with a recap of what we've covered so far in biodiversity before we go into conservation. Okay, we started off with this idea that biodiversity has three aspects to it: habitat biodiversity, species biodiversity, and genetic biodiversity. Then we kind of go on to concentrate on the last two types, okay? And we looked at the different types of biodiversities and kind of focusing on species biodiversity and genetic diversity, okay? This idea that biodiversity can be measured, okay? And the way we do that is by using sampling techniques, and we have specific set of considerations that we have to make before we do a sampling study. We need to consider things like validity, what's the best technique to use in order to investigate the things that we want to, what techniques do we use when we are sampling plants, what techniques do we use when we're sampling animals. So we had this whole section on kind of how to measure biodiversity, at least how to measure species biodiversity, okay? And what different techniques and approaches and factors do you consider depending on what it is you are investigating. And then we looked at the different techniques that are needed to look at animals. And then we also looked at, well, you know, how do we estimate population sizes? With plants, it's percentage cover. With animals, we use the mark and recapture technique to estimate that population size based on the sample that we collect. And then we considered kind of different types of sampling strategy depending on what it is that you're looking at and the different kind of scenarios that you might be presented with. So, you know, sampling plants, sampling invertebrates in leaf litter, sampling in water. So that was sampling. And then we moved on to what we do with that sampling data, which is calculation of biodiversity and what that number means. So we can calculate a value for biodiversity. What is that value telling us? So first we looked at species diversity, and remember, species diversity consisted of the different types of species being richness, the numbers of, or the population size of each species, then being evenness, and both come together in the index of biodiversity. We looked at how to calculate that and what that value means. So what does a high biodiversity value mean? What does a low biodiversity value mean? And what's the significance of that value? And this is essentially what conservation relates to. It's this idea that ideally you want to be in a situation where you've got high biodiversity, because that is what prepares, or what the best scenario is, whereby given environmental changes, given the impact of the human populations and human developments, because of that, you know, environments, climates are changing, and the ecosystems, the populations that are best suited to deal or be able to survive those changes are those that have high genetic variation, high biodiversity, okay, rather than low biodiversity, okay. Then we looked at the idea of genetic variation, this idea that genetic variation essentially is having different alleles for the same genes in a population, and why it's important to have high genetic diversity. Again, the idea that a population or a species is much more able to adapt to changing conditions and evolve to survive those conditions if there is enough genetic diversity in the population. There's a higher chance of having alleles that might be advantageous given new conditions, new changes to the environment. Okay, and the way we measure genetic variation is by looking at the number of gene positions in a genome or in a population that have different alleles expressed as a percentage. Okay, and this is where I gave you those example questions, and I will be asking you to bring those in and show me that you've done those, and we'll just kind of check whether you've understood that. Okay, and then again, what it means to have low genetic diversity. Similar idea that if you don't have enough different alleles, the chance of being able to adapt to new situations, to new selection pressures decreases, and the population then is more likely to reduce in size because not enough individuals are able to survive and reproduce. And that brings us to conservation. So next we look at conservation, and we begin with factors that affect the biodiversity. Okay, so before we go into why conservation is important, and then after that we'll look at how conservation is carried out, before all that we look at what are the factors that are affecting the biodiversity. Okay, so three main things, though I rather think that it's one thing: human population growth. Okay, so because of that growth, that human population growth has to sustain not only the population, but to sustain the lifestyle of that population, the things that are needed for the way of life of the individuals in that population. For all that, there's going to be an impact on the natural resources of the planet. Okay, one of those things is agriculture, but we'll talk about that again slightly separately. And then the final thing is, again, human population. There's a few things that are associated with the human population growth that are going to be associated with climate change, and we'll look at that. So even though they're kind of three things here, I do think that actually it's the human population growth that results obviously in more agriculture, because you need to provide food for that growing population. And one of the other things that humans need is energy, and that's one of the main reasons that because of the fossil fuels, because of that adding greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, causing the climate change. So in this slide, I'm just summarizing essentially the scope of what the human impact can be. I'm just going to highlight a few things. I'm going to go into detail in a bit anyway, but this is how I kind of see the human impact and how it all kind of ties in to some central ideas. So the first thing being, the human populations, the three main things that it needs are food, housing and travel, and energy resources and materials. Now, there's more to it than that, but these are the main things that kind of impact on biodiversity resources, so the natural resources of the planet. What I want you to be thinking about here is how do these things needed by the human population, how do they use up and impact on the natural resources that the planet has? Okay, so in terms of food, agriculture, and agriculture requires habitats to be cleared. Okay, so you lose all those organisms in order to have a farm and grow one thing, and because you're replacing many different types of organisms with essentially one, your food crop, you're replacing high biodiversity with low. Okay, with housing and travel, again, a similar idea. You need space to build houses, buildings, etc., roads. Okay, and this clears this. You need to remove natural habitats in order to make the space for that. Okay, clear space for roads and rail. Ultimately, you are destroying and fragmenting natural habitats. Okay, and we'll just kind of discuss what the fragmentation. So I think we all understand destroy natural habitat, but fragmenting habitats is an important idea also. This idea, say you have an area, it's got an ecosystem, and what you do is you build a road right through that big one. And because of that, now what you've done is you've made it impossible for the organisms on this side to go here, so you've blocked that, and for the organisms from this side to go there. What that means is that you've reduced the population size. So before you had populations which were this big, but now you've got two separate communities, I guess, and the population of all the species in those communities is now much smaller. You've reduced because you've reduced the population sizes, you've reduced the evenness, okay? And what you potentially have done then is reduce the genetic variation, because these individuals cannot reproduce with them, and these individuals cannot reproduce with these, and so the gene pool for each population has become much smaller, and you've reduced genetic diversity, and therefore you have reduced the evolutionary potential, I guess, the adaptability of each population, because you've reduced the genetic diversity. Okay, so destroying habitats is one thing, fragmenting habitats is also quite harmful. Okay, right, final thing, energy and materials resources. So, you know, for building materials, we've got to cut down trees, ropes, fibers, you know, whatever we kill living organisms in order to gain something from them, that obviously we lose that biodiversity every time we do that. And the other thing is energy. Now, this is not, strictly speaking, we're not using up a biological resource per se, but it's more to do with the impact of using that, or the impact of using fossil fuels, the combustion, the addition of chemicals that normally wouldn't be added back to the environment in those volumes or in those rates, and causing pollution. Okay, and because of that pollution changes the environmental conditions for the living organisms, making it more difficult for them to survive. Okay, so next we then kind of zoom in on those different things, and we start with the human population growth. Remember, there were those three things, okay? Human population growth, agriculture, and climate change. Okay, so humans, because of the way we have evolved, we have the capacity to change our environment to suit us. Other organisms have to adapt to their environment. We change our environment to suit us to a certain extent. Okay? And because of that, we have the ability to change ecosystems. For example, to provide food for ourselves, shelter, and so on. And because of that, there is a potential of destruction and fragmentation of habitats. It just has to occur in order to, in order to build a mall or a building or a set of houses to shelter individuals and so on. We must remove natural habitats in order to do that. Okay, and the problem being that humans use up natural resources in an unsustainable way. Okay, so it's okay to cut down some trees if you're planting as many trees. However, humans have a tendency to use up resources faster than those resources can be regenerated, and this is called being unsustainable. And that's one of the biggest problems with the human population growth. Not essentially using the resources, that's technically is okay. However, using them in an unsustainable way where they're not being regenerated as fast as they're being used, that is then eventually it's going to be bad for the human population because we're going to run out of that resource. It's going to be bad for the species involved because their population size is going to, over time, is going to decrease to the point of extinction. Next, agriculture. Agriculture has a number of effects on ecosystems. We're going to look at it from two aspects. First, the effect on the ecosystem being lost. So let's look at a scenario where we had a forest, for example. We remove the forest in order to grow a crop that's going to feed the human population. So first, what's the effect on the ecosystem? So obviously we've cleared some wild plants to grow a single variety of plant food. This reduces species richness. Okay, and therefore it reduces the species biodiversity of that habitat, that area. This reduces the space available for the wild species. Okay, and therefore their population size decreases. Because their population size decreases, it causes their genetic variation to decrease. Fewer individuals, the potential for fewer different alleles. This means that population is more likely to become endangered or extinct. A, because the population numbers are going down. B, because even if that population is able to maintain itself at a low size, if the environment changes, that population might not have the genetic variation to allow that population to adapt. Okay. Next, how agriculture affects the crop varieties. Okay, so the plant species that's being used as the crop, there's even kind of negative impact on that, right? Let's explain that. So the idea is that any kind of crop plant was at some point a natural, it had natural variation. It was a species that was wild. However, humans saw that it was useful. They decided to grow it to supply food for the population. Now, the thing is that, all species contain genetic variations, but certain varieties are, the humans consider to have desirable characteristics or traits or phenotypes. Okay, and what the humans do then is carry out the process of selective breeding. Okay, and what they do is then select the plants with the characteristics that the humans consider useful or advantageous, and then use those plants to produce offspring that combine these useful traits in a single plant. Okay, what you get then is if you're growing you're growing a cauliflower. Okay, then what happens is at some point you get the ideal cauliflower. It tastes great, it looks great, has a great texture, it cooks properly, grows fast. It's got all these characteristics, but there's no variation then. All right, so you're only growing essentially one variation of that species, and this is called a monoculture. Okay, and there's advantages and disadvantages to that. The advantages are on the human size for now, all right, and the disadvantages are kind of more for the population, for the species, and more in the future for the humans. Okay, so the advantages are that you've got all these desirable traits such as taste, appearance, growth rate, all of that. You've got all those characteristics in one plant, and that makes, because they've got all these because they're so similar, it makes harvesting easier. It makes automated harvesting possible, and then because of that you can grow them on a large scale, and that is good for the human population. It means people get fed. Okay, and then when you walk into a supermarket, all the stuff that you look at is great quality. All the apples look the same, all the cauliflowers, they look the same, taste the same. okay? And on some level that's good for us. It's based on our desires ultimately, okay? But it is not good for that species in general, because that species is losing varieties. Let's talk more about that. So monocultures, because they've been bred in a certain way, they all have similar traits, they have low genetic diversity, okay? This means that populations are very vulnerable to any new diseases, pests, or environmental changes, because they all have the same alleles, essentially. There's not a lot of variation, and so if any environmental change happens, that species doesn't have the different alleles in that population that might allow some of that population to survive. And then if a new disease comes, or a pest, or a climatic change happens, it's not just some or most of the population that's affected, it is all of that population, and they might all not survive that change. Okay? The other thing is that as the humans concentrate on the characteristics that are useful to them for now, some potentially useful in the future, some potentially useful traits may be ignored, and therefore those alleles are lost from the gene pool, and we'll look at an example of that next. So this gradual loss of alleles, because of the gradual loss of alleles is called genetic erosion, and one of the things that contributes to that is selective breeding. So let's have a look at how this could happen. So in this example right here, I've got a population of rabbits. Some of them are brown, some of them are white. They have genetic variation because they have alleles for a brown coat, capital B, dominant allele, and they have alleles for a white coat, the recessive little b. Okay, but both alleles are present in the population, so there is variation there. However, let's look at the situations where human prefers rabbits with brown coat colors. Now, as a result of that, what they do is they take the brown rabbits, allow the brown rabbits to breed, but they don't include the white rabbits in the process of the selective breeding, and so offspring rabbits are more likely to be brown. Again, those brown rabbits are used for selective breeding, and in that case, over a number of generations, what happens is that at some point you'll get all the rabbits being brown, and because the white rabbits were not included in the breeding program, then what happens is that the little b allele tends to be lost over a number of generations. Ultimately, you end up with a population that only has the big B allele. The little b allele has been lost. Not that any allele is kind of targeted for being lost, but the idea is that if you keep selecting certain characteristics outwardly, so you keep breeding the brown rabbits, you might be losing other alleles inadvertently. Okay, so that's the idea of genetic erosion. Next, so climate change is the third impact that can happen because, or the third factor that can affect biodiversity. And we're just going to spend a little bit of time recapping how humans can, or how humans are impacting on the climate. This idea that human activities such as fossil fuel combustion, such as deforestation, they increase molecules in the atmosphere that contain carbon dioxide, methane, etc. These carbon-based molecules are known as greenhouse gases because they are capable of absorbing infrared radiation. And when they do that, when they absorb the infrared radiation, they gain energy, and transfer this energy to other gases in the atmosphere, raising the atmospheric temperature. Okay, and when this happens, global, land temperatures increase, the oceanic temperature increases. It's not just the atmosphere, it impacts on all aspects. And then what happens is that because of this, the phenomenon that we call global warming, because of this, it changes the environmental conditions away from what many species have evolved to survive in. Okay, so conditions being stable over time, organisms have adapted to a particular set of conditions. Suddenly, the environmental conditions change and they go outside of the tolerance range of those organisms. Because of that, it affects their chance of survival, and that's what we call a selection pressure. And what we've kind of hinted at before is, well, if the populations are healthy, if biodiversity is high, then ecosystems and organisms can adapt to these changes, okay, as they happen. However, if species and genetic diversity is low, there's less chance that this adaptation can happen. And therefore, then those populations, they are not adapted to those conditions, they cannot adapt, or they have a much less ability or much reduced ability to adapt, and therefore the population size goes down as their survival chances decrease. Okay, and as the population then goes down, we get to the point where organisms, their populations are so low that they become endangered, and then when the last members of that population die, they are then extinct. Okay, so then what organisms can do in response to changing conditions is migrate. Okay, so this diagram here is an example of one particular organism, Plasmodium falciparum, that causes malaria. Okay, and the yellow is the current distribution of malaria, or the parasite that causes malaria is the current distribution of that organism, because it's adapted to survive at a certain set of conditions which are found in these particular locations or geographical locations. Okay, the idea being that by 2050, if climate change continues, the organism that causes malaria will, the set of conditions in which malaria thrives, those areas will not be the current, where the current malaria distribution is. The distribution of malaria will change in the future as the organism populates areas that are becoming warmer. Okay, and the idea being that where it currently is, if climate change continues, where it currently is going to get too hot, I guess, and then the places where malaria will then find most ideal are starting to move away from its current distribution and starting to move towards new places which now have the conditions where that it is adapted to. Okay, so that's the North Pole, so that's the pole there, that's the South Pole here. So as the global temperatures increase, you will find that organisms start to move to new areas where the conditions now suit their adaptations, whereas previously they didn't. Okay, so this idea of migration is important. The next idea is this, that while organisms could migrate, the problem is that there's some obstructions to their migration. and some of them are natural, but some of them are due to humans. So in terms of the natural obstructions, you have large bodies of water that might prevent organisms that aren't adapted to swim or can't survive in those conditions. It will prevent their migration. Mountain ranges, anything that are going to prevent the migration of organisms, that is going to prevent them from finding new places that suit their adaptations. Humans also create some obstacles to migration. You can see in this picture right here that because of these roads that have been built, because of these buildings that have been built, because of these areas that are being maintained, this might prevent. So if you had some organisms in this forest, for example, they would not be able to migrate through this area because of the human developments, because of the road, the traffic, all the areas that are kind of maintained in a certain way. Because of that, it will prevent the migration of organisms. Now, if that happens, then the organisms, they are then kind of prevented from moving away from this area where the conditions are changing, either due to human impact or because of climate change. The conditions are changing, they cannot move, and so they are stuck in this place where the conditions no longer suit their adaptations. They will have a reduced chance of survival, and because of that, the population size will go down until we might get to a point where extinction might happen. Okay? So, summarizing all that is this extinction narrative. So it's just a little story, kind of putting all these different things together in one idea that hopefully allows all the details to make a little bit more sense. Okay, so the idea, going back to the beginning, that human activity reduces the size of natural habitats. Because of that, the populations of organisms get smaller, and because the populations get smaller, the genetic diversity decreases. Then human activity changes the climate, and presents organisms with a bit more challenge than otherwise they would have. And as the environment changes, populations don't have enough genetic diversity to adapt to the changes. We've spoken about that idea, okay? And they would migrate, but there are obstacles to their migration. And because the conditions are changing, they don't have enough genetic diversity to adapt to those changes, or the changes are happening too fast for the process of natural selection to happen. And there are obstacles to migration. Because of that, individuals can't survive, reproduce, and populations get even smaller until the population becomes endangered or is classified as an endangered species, and then further, when the last member of the species dies, we have extinction. So this is the story, this is the idea that kind of links up everything that we've been speaking about. These have been the factors that affect biodiversity, mainly due to the growing human population. Now the next thing we'll do is we'll look at what the value of biodiversity is. What are the reasons that we should be maintaining biodiversity?